Hello, and welcome to episode 3 of the Bylund Clinic Podcast. Last time, we talked a little bit about my number one issue with psychoeducational evaluations, namely that no one in the world understands what they say, and yet, psychologists write them and then hand them to parents and teachers and expect them to be able to use that information to do something meaningful for the kid, and yet it's written in a way that nobody other than the psychologist could even understand what it says. So today, what I'd like to do is sort of jump into a series of talks just discussing psychoeducational evaluations, namely specific learning disorders like dyslexia and dysgraphia, dyscalculia, maybe even do one on ADHD and perhaps some other areas that impact a child's learning and school performance that they might receive an evaluation from the school for and may have a psychoeducational evaluation completed. So my hope in doing that is to talk a little bit about what those disorders are, how they're assessed, and hopefully help make some sense out of those reports that were completed for the rest of us, right? Those of us who are not psychologists, so namely parents and teachers as well. And so we're going to jump into that today and talk about dyslexia. Before I do that, though, just wanted to note that if you have any questions for me regard to this podcast or any other related topic, or any suggestions for the podcast, a topic that you'd really like to have me discuss, please contact me. You can do that at info@drjamesbylund.com. So info@drjamesbylund.com. Or on social media, which I sort of joked about in the last podcast. It's something that's really brand new to me, but I'm trying to figure out how to do it all. But you can find me Facebook and Instagram at the Bylund Clinic. So without any further ado, I guess I'll jump right into our topic for today, which is psychoeducational evaluations for dyslexia. I suppose a reasonable place to start out with is just what is a learning disorder, right? And that kind of provides some context then for the rest of our discussion. And essentially, a learning disorder is an unexpected underachievement in some area of academic achievement, so reading, writing, or math, right? And so if a child's academic achievement in reading, writing, or math is unexpectedly low when we consider how old they are and the grade that they're in, when we take into consideration just their general intellectual or conceptual abilities, when we take into consideration their educational history, right? Like they've been in school the whole time, and for a lot of these kids even received additional remedial intervention, whether it's at school or at home. And yet their achievement falls well below where we'd expect it to be. Now, there's a bunch of statistics that go into analyzing, how significant is the underachievement, and that's a pretty big topic in and of itself. And so we'll probably save that for another separate podcast where we can kind of really get into what all those statistics mean. So I'm not going to do that today, but that underachievement, it has to be statistically significant, right? We all have our own patterns of strengths and weaknesses. There's some things we're better at than others, but for a learning disorder to be present, that underachievement really has to be statistically significant when we consider their age and their intellectual ability. So I'd like to kind of walk through that a little bit more closely, right? And so how do we determine if something's sort of unexpected underachievement, Now, when we compare it to their age, that's pretty straightforward. So, we have tests that we give, and those tests are normed, basically meaning those tests are given to hundreds or thousands of other kids, and we can then compare a child's performance against others that are their age or their grade level, right? And that's pretty straightforward, right? So, if you have a 10-year-old, like my oldest son is 10, right? I would administer a test, and then I could see how that compares to other 10-year-olds, right? That's pretty straightforward. The next part of this is where it probably gets a little bit more, just not as clear, right? In terms of how their reading achievement, for example, with dyslexia, compares to their general intellectual ability or other conceptual skills. And the reason why this gets a little bit more, less clear is now we're talking about really abstract concepts, right? When I compare it to my son's age, I know exactly how old he is, right? He's 10 years and 2 months, I know what grade he is in, right? He's going into 5th grade. But what is intellectual ability, right? I mean, we might think we know or have some general sense of it, but I'm going to tell you right now, there's no universal definition of what that is, right? So what we have instead are tests that measure various conceptual skills, right? So they measure skills like verbal ability, right? So basically your vocabulary and verbal reasoning skills, and we can compare that to other kids someone's age, right? So in the case of my son, other 10-year-olds. There's other conceptual abilities like what they call fluid reasoning, right? Now I think most of us will probably hear verbal ability, and we kind of understand what that means. Fluid reasoning is not exactly something that rolls off our tongue in day-to-day conversations, So what they basically mean there when we give tests and it says fluid reasoning is basically my ability to see patterns in information, right? My ability to see a problem I've never seen before, look at the various elements of it, see what patterns there may be in that information, and then be able to predict what might come next, and so we've got a number of tests that assess that, and as far as our day-to-day functioning, that has a lot to do with reasoning and problem solving with math, or reasoning and problem solving when we're trying to make a persuasive argument in composing a writing piece, right? My ability to sort of analyze problems that might emerge in the text as I'm reading, right? So it's this ability to see patterns and solve problems that I've never seen before. And what that also allows me to do then is sort of generalized learning, right? So I can look at a problem I've never seen before and then apply other things I know to be able to figure out that problem, right? That's that fluid reasoning ability. And the other really sort of core conceptual skill that the tests look at is what they call visual spatial processing. And for the most part, what these tests measure are skills related to be able to kind of create images in my mind's eye and be able to sort of rotate those images in space in my imagination and see how I can take different pieces and construct something new. And that's the sort of visual spatial abilities. Now, we'll talk about this more in future podcasts. Clearly when we go to school, most of the information that's presented and most of the learning that occurs has to do with language. So, 80% of what goes on in school is language based. And that's either listening or talking, but also reading and writing, right, are also ways of processing language. So that's most of what we do in school. So there isn't a lot that really in traditional school settings that taps into this visual spatial ability, and yet it's incredibly important, right? Because if you were to sort of just look at the world around you, everything that you see at one time didn't exist, right? At one time it was sort of created in somebody's mind, and they figured out how to create something new out of things that already existed, right? And that's just a visual spatial ability. And in school, it's still important. It has a lot to do with being able to sort of our intuitive number sense, right? Like my ability to estimate quantities and judge distances and magnitude and the distance between numbers. And it doesn't allow me to sort of calculate things real precisely, but it gives me a general sense of things when it comes to numbers, which can be really helpful for math achievement. So now why do I say all that, right? So we're talking about this verbal ability, these fluid reasoning or problem solving skills, these visual spatial skills. These are these sort of core sort of higher level conceptual abilities. And when we're looking at a learning disability, whether it's reading, writing, or math, but in this case we're talking about reading, what we're doing, again, is not just comparing reading achievement to somebody's age, but comparing reading achievement to their conceptual abilities. And the reason why this is done is because if somebody's sort of general processing and general conceptual abilities was lower, we'd expect in most cases for their academic skills to pretty much fall in line with that. But when we're looking at kids that have learning disabilities, we see this difference, this what they call, like in schools, a discrepancy, right? This difference between where somebody's conceptual abilities are and where their development in, well, in this case, reading is, right? And so that's why we take a look at those abilities. And again, we can talk about this in a future podcast, but that difference has to be statistically significant, right? Not just a little bit below, but well below where we'd expect given their sort of general intellectual ability or conceptual abilities fall, right? Now, in terms of dyslexia, what we're really looking for in terms of that underachievement is underachievement in what they call basic reading, reading fluency, and typically spelling goes along with that too. And so what I mean by basic reading is just somebody's ability to read words. We look at kids' abilities to read real words. We look at kids' abilities to read words they've never seen before, right? They're called nonsense words, right? Sort of these made-up words, and we've got to decode them. And then we also look at their reading fluency. So not just their accuracy in reading those words, but how quickly they can read them, right? Because for efficient reading to take place, which is needed in order to not only kind of keep pace, but really to be able to comprehend the text well, we need to read pretty quickly, and so we look at their reading fluency as well. And what we know is that kids with dyslexia will read at a much, much slower pace. And so sometimes we see kids with terrible word reading accuracy, and that really slows them down. Sometimes we see kids whose their word reading accuracy is a little bit better, but it's just terribly dysfluent, right? It just takes forever for them to do it, and that is equally dyslexia, right? And then of course we see difficulties with spelling too. So, if they're having a hard time reading the words, they're in all likelihood having a hard time spelling them as well too. And in a second here, we'll talk about different types of dyslexia. In some words, kids might be able to sound out words reasonably well, and yet their spelling and reading fluency are really poor. And so, we look at all three of these. Now, reading comprehension deficits, that's certainly a learning disability, but when we're talking about dyslexia, it's really specific to basic reading fluency, and spelling. And so again, when we see a child's achievement in those three areas falling well below what we'd expect given their age and intellectual ability, then that is dyslexia. Now, there's a lot of different underlying causes of that, right? But if we see that, then and it's not due to some environmental factor like they just never went to school or something like that, then that is dyslexia. And then further assessment can kind of help us understand why that might be. Now, in California, for special education eligibility purposes, there's a lot of emphasis in schools that put on identifying this underlying processing disorder. Now, meaning the sort of area of processing that's contributing to the reading deficit. Now, personally, I find that very valuable. I think that's very valuable information. And I really want to get into this in much more detail in a future podcast. It really requires some time to kind of like walk through why this is the case. But the short of it is the federal special education regulations do not require that a team identify a processing disorder. So if you have a child that has been assessed and there was a discrepancy, like their reading was way below where we'd expect, and they said, well, yeah, but they don't qualify because they don't have a processing disorder, there's a really strong case that they made a mistake when they said that, because it's actually not required. Now, again, in a future podcast, I can get into all of that in a lot more detail. But for the purpose of this podcast, I just want to note it. With that said, though, particularly with reading, I think we have some pretty good evidence behind areas of processing that are related to reading development. And so, in my opinion, it is really important that assessments look at those areas. And the three big ones are what they call phonological processing, orthographic processing, and rapid naming. And each of these are really tightly associated with reading development. And so the big one is phonological processing. Now, again, these are terms that we just never use in day-to-day conversation, which is why when they write these reports, they don't make any darn sense whatsoever, right? Because they're using language and statistics that nobody in the world is familiar with, right? So what phonological processing is really just our ability to process the individual or the sounds within words, right? All the way down to the individual sounds within words. But as kids develop, I mean, these include things like being able to rhyme, right? Like being able to identify which words rhyme with one another, or being able to identify. So I've got a 5-year-old, right? So now we're he's really big in identifying what the sound that a word starts with, right? And so that's part of phonological processing too, being able to identify the individual sounds in words. And for some of us who are proficient readers, or as adults here, that seems pretty basic, but think about how just absolutely amazing that is. I mean, if I'm talking right now, I'm clearly not stopping even between words as I talk, let alone between each individual sounds in the words. And yet our brain is able to do that. And because our brain is able to do that, then it allows us to create something called an alphabet, right? Where we've got these different symbols that represent each one of these sounds. But if my brain doesn't do that, right? Like if I can't hear the individual sounds within words, where one sound ends and the next one begins, being able to discriminate between similar sounding sounds, being able to blend those sounds and rearrange them in my mind to create new words. If I can't do that, then the whole alphabetic system doesn't really make sense, right? And so learning to read words is very, very difficult. So it's really important that we take a look at that. And most kids that have dyslexia will have deficits in this area of phonological processing. Now, there's other areas too, though, because some kids have great phonological processing and yet they struggle to read. And there's other possible contributors to that. So one of those is called orthographic processing, which I think the most straightforward way to talk about that is really just the visual aspect of reading. So if phonological processing is being able to process the sounds, orthographic processing is the ability to remember the way that the words look, right? Now, most of us don't sound out words as we read along, right? We read four or five words at a time, probably just sort of scanning a page. Now, truth be told, I'm also a person with dyslexia, so I don't read that way. I literally read word by word as a very educated adult. But my understanding from talking to other people is that they can scan a page and read a bunch of words at one time and just process it that way, which I think is absolutely bizarre but amazing, right? And so, that's our orthographic processing ability, right? I can just sort of scan a page and I just see the word and the combination of the sequences of letters, right? And it just sort of associates with this meaning in my mind. And I do that at just absolute lightning speed, right? And it also helps with spelling, right? Because then I can remember the way the word looks when I go down to spell it. And so when we have kids that have difficulties with orthographic processing, maybe they do okay with just sort of like decoding, like sounding out words. Their phonics is pretty much in place, and yet when they see words that don't make phonemic sense, which is a whole lot of them in the English language, they have a hard time reading that one. They don't read very efficiently because they're literally sounding out words as they go along. And their spelling is usually pretty terrible as well. That's the camp that I fall into. Absolutely horrible speller. I can't remember the way words look for the life of me. Now, the third area of processing is what they call rapid naming. Now, this area of processing really, truly just has to do with how quickly my brain makes that association between those text symbols and what they represent, right? So that's a lot to do with that fluency piece, but even just being able to decode words, right? And be able to just do that rapidly, like make those rapid associations between those symbols and their sounds quickly enough for me able to then blend all those sounds together and form a word. We're really processing information at really lightning speed, when we do that. And now the thing is, we can assess all these, right? So independent of reading, right, we can give tests where we can assess how well somebody can process the sounds within words, how well they remember the way that words look, how quickly they make those associations. And when we see deficits in that area, and then we also see this underachievement in reading, we can usually say like, hey, we not only do we see this underachievement, we see some weakness in an area of processing that probably accounts for part, if not all, of that underachievement in reading. And it also can be very helpful. Like I mentioned earlier, I believe very firmly you do not need the processing disorder to be eligible for services. And now I've only worked in California, so I know that's probably crazy probably for a lot of people in California here, because we're so stuck on that processing disorder. I don't know what it's like in other states. If you're listening to this in another state and you're like, oh yeah, of course, well, congratulations, your state gets the law. In California here, I think we're a little confused on that aspect. But that doesn't mean I don't think the processing disorder is not important. I think it is, because then that helps us know how to help a child too, right? If we know that they have a hard time processing the sounds, we really need to make sure they can do that really well, right? If they're having a hard time doing it quickly, there may be other strategies we implement to help them process that information more quickly. Or if they have a hard time remembering the way that words look, there's things we can do to help them with that. So I do think understanding that underlying psychological processing deficit can be helpful in terms of intervention as well. So anyhow, if your child has been assessed for special education under the category specific learning disability, whether particularly for reading, whether they were found eligible or not, that report probably didn't make a whole lot of sense. I'm hoping that this might have helped make it make a little bit more sense. If it didn't, email me, hit me up on social media, ask your questions. This is really, it can be unbelievably confusing for folks that don't do this for a living. Like, those are, in my position, it just seems to make so much sense, and I don't think we stop to check for understanding with everybody else around us, and I think most people, it doesn't make sense, and sort of politely remain quiet at IEP meetings until the psychologist stops talking. But if you do have questions, I do think it's important to understand it, and so I'm certainly can be a resource that you reach out to. So again, email info@drjamesbylund.com. You can also hit me up on social media, Instagram and Facebook at the Bylund Clinic. Again, if you have any questions about this podcast or about this topic more generally, I would love to hear those and be able to respond to them, as well as any suggestions that you have for the podcast as well too. So quick disclaimer, I probably should have said this at the outset and neglected to, but I'll say it now. Again, this is just very general information. It's not specific about you or your child. It's not diagnostic in any way. Nothing here provides any specific recommendations or any specific legal advice. I'm not even an attorney, right? So I want to throw that out there. But I do want to be able to provide information that is hopefully helpful to individuals with learning differences, and to their parents and families and teachers and everybody who is working hard to support them. So anyhow, thank you so much for joining me again for episode 3 of the podcast, and I look forward to meeting with you again. Take care.